Can everybody hear me at the back? I hope this is on. Yes, great, brilliant, nice waves. Nice to see so many people here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Kathy Newman. I normally present Channel 4 News around this time. Delighted to be here with you today because my other roles are I'm also a patron of Kids Charity and an ambassador for Young Minds UK. So it's kind of in that capacity that I'm here tonight to host this really important event on declining rates of child mental health from Pro Bono Economics. I have two daughters, one who's 20, so practically a grown-up. Still leaves her room in a mess, though. Still lives at home. The other is still a teenager, and I've watched their generation really struggle through the pandemic, battling unresponsive services, a lack of funding, and frankly, a world that kind of cocooned itself during the pandemic physically, and yet seemed somehow uncaring or not caring enough about the impact of that whole period on the mental health of children. And I think we're really seeing the toll that that's taken now. And just last week, I bumped into someone I knew locally who told me about his son who was autistic. And he'd struggled at school for years and just hadn't been able to access the help that he needed despite years of battling. And he took a real downward turn during the pandemic, hit a real crisis, and at that point the system failed him in every possible way. And tragically he took his own life at the age of just 15. And he was one of around 200 teenagers who lose their lives in the UK to suicide every year, which is a horrifying statistic. So there's a really urgent need to have this conversation tonight, and I'm delighted to be able to play my part in leading this conversation. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Welcome to everybody in the room, but also online. We're streaming this event. Thank you in advance to our fantastic speakers who are going to be sharing their insights and experiences. Thank you to the three event sponsors, the Rigby Foundation, Oxford Economics, and Exchange Data International. Their support has been really essential in making tonight happen. And thank you to the Wellcome Collection for hosting us this evening. Through its collections and exhibitions, Wellcome explores the past, present and future of health in the belief that everyone's experience of health matters. So it's clearly a very fitting venue for our conversation tonight. Just a few little operational thoughts. Do post about the event, post your thoughts, or you can scan the QR code on screen. Somewhere. There should be a QR code. Well, maybe just post on whatever platform you want to post on. Welcome to reshare the Pro Bono Economics tweets as well. Our discussion will run until just before 7:30, and then we invite you all to join us for a drink next door, up the stairs to continue the conversation. And just as a formality, there are no fire drills planned, so if you hear the fire alarm, follow the exit signs if you need to use them. So I would like to welcome our first speaker to the stage, Matt Whitaker, who is CEO of Pro Bono Economics. Please give Matt a warm welcome.
Thanks, Kathy, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of PBE, welcome to everybody here this evening. Really delighted to have so many people here on a topic which has become almost organically quite an important one for PBE over the last 18 months, 2 years or so. We found ourselves working increasingly with charities and other organisations that are working in this space, which is perhaps a sign of what's going on in wider society. And so much so that actually now it's become an explicit focus for us. So it's going to be one of our flagship programmes over the next 12 to 18 months or so. So in doing that, in moving into this space in a bigger way, we're very clear that we don't have, unfortunately, any secret formulas or magic answers. Instead, what we want to do is add value where we can. And so from that perspective, I'm really pleased to see, both in terms of fellow panellists today, but also the expertise we have in the room, that we have a great network already that we want to build out on as well. So do get involved tonight, do keep the conversation going once we've finished, and do look for other ways of working with PBE over the next few years, because, as I say, we want to add value to all of the fantastic things that so many people in this room are already doing. Now, you're so good, it's slightly intimidating, I have to say. I am definitely the least qualified person in this room to talk about young people and mental health, because I do not have the expertise that you guys do. I am, however, a white male of a certain age, so I do have an excess of self-confidence, so we'll give it a go. But what it also means is I go first, which means I get to set the rules. And the rules are I'm providing some context, I'm doing some charts. My fellow panelists are going to handle all the difficult questions when it comes later. So that makes it a bit easier. And I also get to set the rules on the definitions for tonight. And I've been talking about mental health so far. You'll see on the slide there it talks about mental well-being. And that's deliberate. Because whilst the definitions really matter, and we might get into some of that in the conversation, they matter in terms of the people we're talking about, they matter in terms of the solutions you might be looking at. What I want tonight to be about is that wider conversation. About why is it that too many kids in the UK just aren't okay? And what can we do about that? So you'll see as we go through, I sort of use the terms a bit interchangeably. Apologies in advance for that. But it is a deliberate move to try and keep it broad tonight, to try and talk about mental well-being amongst children in the widest possible sense. So let's get into it with a chart which probably won't surprise anyone in this room, but hopefully doesn't lose the power to shock. Because, and again, I'm up against time here, so I'm not going to get into all the details of all the axes here. Some of you will know this data, understand it, great. Those that don't, I'll try and give you the headlines as we go. And the headline here is an upward shaped curve is bad news. Because what we've got here is the proportion of 10 to 15-year-olds in the UK scoring high or above on the strength and difficulties questionnaire. So effectively, these are kids who have a mental health challenge in some form or other. And what you can see is that it rose modestly in the first half of the 2010s and then really took off from 2016. And Kathy's already mentioned the pandemic, which clearly was a very big moment in all of our lives, but particularly our young people. But actually, this particular trend growing before the pandemic and has outlasted it too. And what we end up with is an increase from about 15% of kids in this position to 1 in 4 today, 25%. As I say, not a figure that should surprise anyone here, but it doesn't lose the power to say that 1 in 4 children struggling with mental health. A slightly different measure, very closely related, which is the NHS take on this. And this is England only, it's a slightly different age group. The time series doesn't stretch back quite as far. And this takes the same sorts of questions around the strength and difficulties questionnaire and turns it into a sense of what proportion of kids have a probable mental disorder. So the levels are a bit different here because we've got, as I say, different things going on, but the shape is the same. You see again and again this sharp increase over what is now, 6, 7, 8 years. We've talked about children primarily. Tonight is about young people too. And if we look at the 20 to 23-year-old age group, again, time series is even shorter in this case, but it looks like the same sort of thing is going on. So this is not just children. This is not just one particular cohort. This is happening for all of our children and young people. And then this measure is a bit different. I talked about well-being. This is OECD data. Only comes around every 3 years or so. Has some advantages, which I'll get into in a minute. But this is asking children of themselves whether they are satisfied with their lives. So it's a different measure. Again, different age group. This is just 15-year-olds. And it's a bit noisy because it's only once every 3 years. But while the precise shape might be different, the overall story being told, the sharp increase, is very consistent, very familiar, unfortunately. So a large challenge, one that's growing. I mentioned the OECD data being helpful. It is helpful because of this. It allows us to look at international comparisons. And what we've got here is a selection of countries from Western Europe and looking at their scores for the proportion of kids reporting low well-being, low life satisfaction, and the change between 2015 and 2022. So again, the headline here is, if the pink dot is to the right of the blue dot, then that means things are getting worse, and that is obviously bad news. And what you see is consistently across these countries, yes, things are getting worse, and often quite significantly so. And as the note on the right-hand side says, actually, if you look across the 41 countries for which we've got data across these two time points, 39 of them are in a position where things have got worse. So this is not just a UK phenomenon. And that's worrying in one aspect because it means there's something global going on here. It's bigger than just saying, okay, well, let's just copy what country X is doing. But having said that, UK does still stand out for two reasons. One, the size of the increase that the UK has experienced in that time period is large, so 9 percentage point increase, which is the 7th highest percentage point increase across those 41 countries. But also it's from a very high starting point relative to what you might consider to be comparable countries. And what that leaves you with is the chart which is all too depressingly familiar, I'm sure, to most people here, which is the UK overall sitting right at the bottom of the international league table in terms of the well-being of its 15-year-olds. Fourth, fifth richest country in the world, depending on how you look at it, but we're right at the bottom in terms of the well-being of our young people, and that's clearly a huge concern. So I think so far, so depressingly familiar, unfortunately. The big question for tonight and going forward is, what do we do about this? And to start to get into that, we want to have some sense of, well, what is it that's causing this to happen? And on that side, we've got some sense of answers here. We'll get into some of the details around that in a second. But we know some things. Now, what I'm going to share with you here is work that we've done, again, using that OECD data. And that is very education-focused, which means it's very rich in some variables around schools. It is less rich in others. So this is by no means comprehensive, by no means definitive. I think what is helpful is that the 5 categories I've set out here do chime with what you see from other studies. You know, lots of people have done lots of work in this area, and it's very consistent with what we're about to share. But don't get hung up on the numbers about to share, as will become clear a little bit later. And I'm going to rattle through them really quickly anyway, so you won't be able to, even if you want to, so that we can get to the conversation. But I think what is useful is thinking about these 5 categories as being things which are important when we think about what is going on here. So if we start with school culture, I'm going to use a very sophisticated economic technique, so apologies if this is a bit mind-blowing, but arrows. Arrows that point to the left mean things which are reducing the risk of being in low well-being, and arrows, which we'll get onto, that point to the right, are increasing the risk. So in terms of school culture, there is a clear reduction in the risk of being in low well-being for those kids who say that teachers in their school take an interest in their well-being. Reduces their risk by 14 percentage points. Kids who say they feel a sense of belonging at school, reduces the risk by 7 percentage points. Kids who say that they've heard other kids threaten other students, that increases the risk. Again, as I say, don't worry too much about the numbers at this stage. I'm going to rattle through. But clearly there is something around school culture which is important here. In terms of peer relationships, here I've got variables which are basically talking about bullying and loneliness. No surprise that they are increasing the risk of being in low well-being. In terms of family life, interestingly on this one, what you don't get coming through is a sense that being in a low-income household, being in poverty, is itself a driver of low well-being. But having a perception that your family is somehow low status does drive low well-being. And that is both in terms of money, education, and indeed jobs. Whereas a family that communicates well, that spends a lot of time talking, that reduces the risk of low well-being. In terms of lifestyle, so this data set isn't great on this. So again, the figures here are a little bit partial, but not getting involved in exercise increases the risk of low well-being, and working a few times a week, being in paid work, which may be some sort of proxy for an income situation, but we won't get into the detail of that. These things increase well-being. And then probably the sort of like the most topical one, the one that everyone likes to talk about is digital devices, social media. And there is a variable in this data set which is capturing people who are high volume users of social media. So good news, we can start to test that out. Bad news, we don't get anything very clear. And again, this chimes with lots of research that other people have done, which is that when you're doing these sorts of analyses and you're using data sets which cover the whole population and you're working with averages, things tend to come out in the wash with social media. So yes, cyberbullying, disrupted sleep, harmful content will, I'm sure, be increasing the risk of low well-being. But at the same time, the social aspect of this, the support network that it provides, the creative forum that social media provides, is pulling in the opposite direction. So overall, we get no significant result from this particular one, which is obviously frustrating. What we can say is that some sort of form of dependency on digital devices does seem to increase low well-being when you control for everything else. So there is something in there, but clearly we don't know as much as we would like. So overall, we've got some understanding of drivers, as I say, and as people in this room will be very well aware, we're often very good at doing something about it. PBE's day job is working with organisations to help them understand and measure their impact. And I'm not going to get into detail on this. If you want more detail on this particular one, do have a look on our website. We had a webinar a few months ago with Football Beyond Borders, Be Well, and the University of Manchester, where we got into this particular bit of analysis, and it's a great discussion. So I encourage you to go and have a look at that. But if we just take this Football Beyond Borders example very quickly, here we've got two population groups. One is the group of at-risk students working with Football Beyond Borders, and the other is a comparison group taken from the excellent BeWell data set in Greater Manchester. And very deliberately, they start this period, this is their before intervention wellbeing, with the same levels of wellbeing. If we roll forward a year, then what you see is that for the default group, the group in the BeWell data set who are not engaged with Football Beyond Borders, their satisfaction drops really quite sharply. Whereas for those who are engaged with Football Beyond Borders and therefore having access to a trusted adult in the school environment, they are protected from that reduction. Now, we can't talk about causality here, but you make your own mind up. This looks like pretty compelling evidence. So we're pretty good at finding ways of intervening, supporting, providing protections and ensuring that our children don't go through the crises that they might do. And we have some understanding of what's driving all this, which helps to inform that agenda. But the truth is, we're still constrained by data gaps. We don't know enough about what the problems are. We don't know enough about what the solutions are. So I'm going to have a very quick little thought experiment here. Ooh, getting very loud all of a sudden. So I've replicated the figures from the Netherlands. Is this a bit painful for people? Maybe I'll step away from the microphone for a minute and shout. Replicate the figures for the Netherlands and for the UK in terms of those OECD figures on proportion with low well-being. So what if we say all of those drivers I've just shown you, bullying, loneliness, all the rest of it, we could match the Dutch performance in the UK, what would it look like? Not surprisingly, it improves things, but not all that much. I'll try the microphone again. Are we better now? Yeah, okay, cool. That's a relief. Not all that much. In fact, what we're looking at here is only about a third of that difference can be explained by all of the drivers that we've just walked through. That's why I said don't pay too much attention to the numbers, because in the end, there's a lot we just don't know. And that's clearly a big problem for us. So we need more evidence, which is not surprising that I would say something like that. And of course, finance. This is, we ran a consultation recently with charities and others working in this space and asked them for what their take is on the current financing of well-being, children's mental health and so on and so forth. And what you get here is, again, what you'd expect to hear. That funding tends to be short-term, that there's issues with integrated care boards, issues with the cuts in the public health grant, issues within schools around the public premium, all of which means that we're struggling to coordinate activity across sectors, and all of which means we tend to focus a bit too much on crisis and specific interventions rather than the preventative stuff up front. And that matters a lot for lots of different reasons, not least of which are the economic. So again, another quick thought experiment for you, which is really crude, so apologies, but here we go. That figure I showed you right at the start, the NHS number of kids who are have a probable mental disorder, about 1.2 million. For comparison, the NHS treated about 0.3 million kids in that situation in the same year. They had another 0.6 million referred who didn't get treatment. Now, that might be completely legitimate, but nevertheless, it means that there's a big group who are not getting the treatment. And then if you take the 1.2 million as being a good figure and an accurate figure, then that means there's about another 0.3 million who are just not in the system. Spent about $1 billion on the 0.3 million that were treated. That's about a quarter of the total potential group of 1.2 million here with a potential disorder. That means the gap could be about 3 billion. Okay, like I said, it's very crude. But what does that mean? It just means that whatever we're spending on this, we're not spending enough, and the chances of spending enough look pretty slim, given the current situation. So we can't rely on just dealing with crisis. We have to get upstream. We have to deal with some of the preventative stuff. And that's why last week, supported by lots of people in this room, we called for better evidence in the form of a universal wellbeing measurement, which we think will be beneficial at the individual school level, at the local authority level, for individual teachers, for parents, and of course for national government too. And I think particularly what it will help with is getting in some of that nuance. So the data sets we're working with at the moment are just too small. We can't understand what's really going on for some high-risk groups. We can't really dig into that social media stuff just yet because we don't have enough data. So if we want to tackle the problem and we want to get upstream and deal with the preventative stuff, we've got to get into some of this measurement stuff too. And ultimately, I think as well, it also sends a big signal. If we commit to measuring this and possibly even making it a priority within the education system, then aren't we sending a big signal to the country that this is a priority? So we came up with a 10-point roadmap. I'm not going to go through that. The only thing I will say on this is that that first bit is the most important bit, getting together a cross-sector working group, because as I said at the very start, we're not the experts, we're not trying to drive this. We think it's about working with people in this room in order to make this happen. We hope that government is listening to that. I'm going to stop there. Looking forward to the conversation. As I say, please do direct difficult questions towards other panellists rather than me. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. And you're not going to be able to get away without some difficult questions as well. So don't think you can. Let me move straight now to introduce our excellent array of panellists. Catherine Roche, who's Chief Executive of Place to Be. Matt, you've just heard from, is going to be taken to the stage again and is going to be getting some questions. And Saqib Chowdhury, who's Principal of Oasis Academy, Shirley Park. Let's give them a round of applause as they take to the stage. Well, Matt, those figures were absolutely fascinating, quite depressing as well. I just want to start with you just to flesh out the why, because you had those 5 categories. I was quite surprised, given a lot of the media narrative on digital devices, that you didn't kind of pin more blame on that. Just to expand on that a little bit, can you say which is the sort of biggest driver? I was also interested in your chart about the timeline. Seems to coincide with the sort of takeoff of social media. So perhaps disentangle that. Let's talk about why.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's implausible that social media, digital devices are not playing a significant role in the trends that we've seen. And as I say, others in the room have done much more work on that, much closer to it, much more expert. And I don't want to pretend to know too much. I am speculating here. The difficulty we have and the difficulty we had with the analysis, and people that know about this sort of stuff and the way these statistical models work, it's all a bit mechanical. And you throw a bunch of variables in and it throws out some answers. And I think the issue is when you've just got a question, which is, what's your use of social media? And it talks about number of hours. Then it's quite possible to be a heavy user of social media and to have extremely good well-being. Maybe because you just do, but also maybe because the social media is actually providing you with a real positive outlet. As I say, that creativity that it allows, that ability to build social networks outside of those who are just in your immediate vicinity. These are really positive things. And if you ask anyone here, do you want to give away your phone for a bit? They'd probably say no, because there's lots of real benefit here. The problem is that masks what is also very clear, which is that there are some real problems because the data sets just aren't big enough.
So, I mean, obviously, you've pointed to the problem there that we don't have good enough data. But if you were to sort of hazard a guess about the biggest driver of this poor child mental health, what would you say it is?
Again, this would be speculation, but I think that the 3 things I put up on the slide to me feel like the 3 most important. And I don't know in what order. So that sleep deprivation, I think, is a big thing. As a parent myself, I know that kids are now just sort of 24/7. There is the cyberbullying, which I think will be a more minority thing, but is also shifting norms within friendship groups and within the particular population groups as well. You think about young girls. I can't actually remember the third one, but I think all 3 of them together are the 3 key drivers for me, and I don't know what the order would be.
Right, well, let's bring in the other panellists, see what your answer is to the same question. Catherine Roche first. Why would you say there's been this explosion in mental ill health amongst children?
So I think from our experience of Place to Be, we've been working in this space for now 30 years. And so when we started, nobody spoke about mental health. It wasn't a thing, nobody had the first idea of it. And then I think as time has progressed, there is now a greater understanding around children having good mental health, children having problems, so that there is more understanding around the term of mental health.
So in some ways, we're seeing more of it because we know what it is and we're looking for it.
We're recognizing more of it. I think that is part of it. But there is also, for many years, there's been such an underinvestment and recognition that mental health and mental health problems and challenges, that they exist, and the CAMS end of the service, the more severe end of the service, just there's been such underinvestment for so many, many years. I think we've also seen a huge rise, and particularly we look at poverty, we look at particularly around the time of the pandemic and what that has done. That's definitely driven a spike.
So interesting, the trend, that chart you showed, the trend had, it was a clear upward trajectory before the pandemic, and the pandemic sort of merely carried it on.
And I think it aggravated it, especially. We also haven't measured, so to Matt's point around measurement and understanding what's going on. We were using data from sort of 20 years ago. Then there was an introduction of the national prevalence data, and we saw that go from 1 in 10 to 1 in 9 to then 1 in 6 children and young people. So I think we started to measure it more, but there's also just a real drive of children. What we hear from young people in our schools is greater anxiety, greater depression. They're more anxious about things.
Well, let me bring in Saqib Chowdhury here. I mean, what are you hearing from kids at school? What would be your answer to this question about why?
Yeah, so if you want data on whether or not social media influences children's mental health and behavior, then come and see our exclusion data in any secondary school. There's a reason why nationally schools are moving away from mobile phones. It is something that young people struggle with a lot. I would be even more specific than that, and I would say that we live in an age now where social media is in every single child's hand. It's meant to be 14 plus. We all know it starts in primary school. But beyond that, it's existed in a time, and it's really taken off in a time where IT has been moved out of school. So IT as a subject didn't exist at Key Stage 3 in the national curriculum for many years. I'm a computer scientist. I teach IT. I teach computer science. I've taught it for many years. But just as I was moving into senior leadership, the subject was kind of on its way out due to lots of things. And I'm not going to point fingers at anyone in particular, but lots of different reasons. IT made its way out. So we've got a group of young people now who exist and who have existed for many years who don't have the skills necessary to navigate a complex IT efficient world and have devices from the get-go. And that is toxic. That's a very toxic mix in itself. But beyond that, there's other things that social media does that you probably don't have the data for, but my lived experience of being with young people every day for the last 20 years kind of goes some way, I think, which is to say the isolationism it causes young people. And so you will have households where every single member of the household around the sofa is on their own device. And you will have households where people are in different rooms, all doing different things. They don't come around the table and watch EastEnders anymore. They don't come around the table and have those conversations anymore. Everyone's watching their own Netflix. You might not know what your child's watching. And that isolation, the internet was meant to bring us all more together. I feel like it's brought us all much further apart.
So moving on to sort of what we can do about this, we've had a good stab at answering why the problem is this. I want to stay with you, Saqib, just for now. So would you say that banning smartphones for kids under the age of 16 is part of the answer? Would you say there's more to do in terms of substituting that isolation of social media and everybody on their devices with, reinstating having a family meal or whatever? What's your solution?
I think banning would be a really crude solution. I think empowering young people to navigate a complex world is really the answer.
And to know when to switch it off and put it away.
Yeah, having said that, phones are banned in my school. But
Hold on. I mean, I this whole debate is, ban the phones in school. That's kind of a no-brainer, and most schools do that. Well, a lot of schools do it.
Yeah.
But it's what do you do when you get home? Do you stop your kid using the phone? Do you, as you say, give them the tools to know when they need to put it away?
Families don't have the tools. So there are so many families that don't know how to time limit, screen limit their child's phone, their child's apps. There are so many families who don't know the age limits on apps like Snapchat, etc. And so empowering families, empowering young people, that education program that's been missing from education for the last 10 years needs to kind of catch up.
Right, Catherine, what would you say the solution is? I mean, talking about treatments, but not just sort of when there's a full-blown mental health crisis, we'll come on to that, but just sort of giving parents, teachers, decision makers the tools to nip this in the bud.
Completely. And I completely also agree with banning social media or banning phones is not the solution, because it's such a good way for connection for some young people. And particularly, again, if I go back to the pandemic, that was the way that young people connected with others. So there are some good things, but we need to build the understanding around how to use them well. And again, helping and equipping young people, supporting parents who are also trying to navigate this, again, as a parent of a teenager myself, and also teachers, helping teachers spot behaviors and understand the important role that they can play. You mentioned Trusted Adults and Football Beyond Borders and brilliant work that they do, and having somebody that a young person can connect with, build a positive relationship. These are all the sorts of things that can really support young people.
I'm interested to hear you sort of agree on banning as a blunt instrument. And, the NSPCC, interestingly, doesn't say that smartphones should be banned, but you've got to teach people how to use them. So we'll come on to money, because you mentioned money, and, obviously so much of this is about funding. But obviously it's cheaper to prevent a mental health crisis than it is to treat. So what are the most effective methods of prevention? I'm going to stick with you, Catherine, for now.
Well, I'm not wishing to plug, but Pro Bono Economics did a fantastic piece of work, in fact, a number of times over the years with us. And that data showed that you invest £1 in the service and it delivers an £8 return. So in our case, providing a service embedded within a school where you can promote good mental health and well-being, you can help to build, but it's working hand in hand with the school, help to build resilience, help children build the tools early on, and then be there on the spot to provide the sort of intervention that can meet the needs of that child.
So, what works in your view? And that's interesting to hear about services embedded within schools. What have you trialled that works for kids?
How long have you got? So I think there's an important aspect missing here from the conversation, which is community and the sense of community and a sense of belonging. That's what schools should be ultimately. And we were talking previously before tonight. We were talking earlier, sorry, about the fact that some schools, rightly so, because that's the head teacher's agenda, want to focus on outcomes and focus on results, and they will narrow their mission statement to essentially just be about getting children really strong outcomes. Shirley Park is very much not that. Shirley Park is focused on outcomes. We've got a sixth form in the top 1% of the country, et cetera, et cetera. But we're very much focused on community. So one of our mottos is caring for the community. And Croydon in 2021 had 5 young people murdered as a result of knife crime. I had 2 of those 5 were my students, murdered within 6 months of each other, both innocent victims of knife crime. And on the back of that, I changed something that I used to say to my young people all the time. I used to tell them that our school corridors are not the streets of Croydon. You cannot behave the way that you do in Croydon inside our school. That used to be something that I told them all the time at assembly and whatnot. And when those 2 tragedies happened, so many good people in Croydon reached out to me and said, how do we make a difference? We want to be involved, like, let us in. And I let so many good organizations into my school. We now have 30 plus organizations working in our school. We have an incredible organization, a community kitchen in South Norwood. They come into school, they do an after school club where children cook with them. And then in the evenings on the weekends, our children are then working voluntarily in the South Norwood community kitchen. And so I think some of the solution is community focused. It's about bringing different organizations, such as Place to Be, but also community organizations into the school and giving children a network outside of school that empowers them.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the role of parents in just a second as well, and also how many of those organisations that you're talking about are charities, and what the role of the social sector is. But Matt, I just want you to crunch the numbers. Catherine alluded to this. Every pound you put in delivers, was it 8 back? Tell us about that.
Thanks. I mean, our day job is to work with charities working in a whole range of areas and help them to understand their impact. And again, what you see is that if you're measuring something which is preventative, excuse me, then you're going to get a better return at the back end. The challenge is twofold. One, collecting data on a consistent basis such that when you're going to policymakers, who ultimately are the ones who are going to sanction these things, they accept that evidence. And what can be difficult is we might go with one bit of evidence and they say, don't recognise that one. You go with another one, it's a different measure, and they go, we don't recognise that one. And so having some consistency around the way we measure this is really important. But then the other problem is just the Treasury model. Gus O'Donnell in the audience here famously will always say, when asked this question, the problem is in the Treasury. If you say to me, I will save you £10 billion tomorrow, or I can save you £1 billion today, what are you going to have? You're going to take the £1 billion today, because that's the pressure they're under. And if you think about the election campaign, Keir Starmer talked a lot about moving away from sticking plaster politics. And I think, hopefully that is an opportunity, but the government now has to follow through on that, because it's a no-brainer that prevention is better than just dealing with constant crisis and fixing things that fall through the cracks. But it requires bold government, and at a time of fiscal constraint, and when the message is consistently there's no money left, it requires the government to be bold and to say, but we are finding money for this, because if we don't find money for it, it's a false economy. We're going to lose a cohort of people, and the economy is only going to get worse and worse because we're not being productive anymore.
So it's a bit like the argument with the NHS. You potentially, in order to sort of reform the whole system, you've got to put some money in up front to bring those results.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know I've said that we need more evidence to understand the problem, and we need more evidence about what really works. But the truth is, you bring the people in this room together and give us 2 hours sitting together, we could come up with a pretty good list. But lots of these people are competing for different pots of funding rather than being in a position where they're allowed to collaborate. We're not in the same forum where we're bringing in private sector, public sector, education into the conversations about what the issue is here, because the whole thing is just premised on dealing, fingers in dikes. And we have to fix that.
Catherine, what would be your plea, if the Chancellor was in the room, if Wes Streeting was in the room, what would be your plea in terms of resources in this sector?
To move upstream, I would say invest in mental health services, invest in the right capacity in primary schools, especially, to try and get ahead of it. And that can also be around the well-being and some of the things you talked about, the well-being end of things, to try and get ahead of it, to build capacity with parents, but invest in primary schools to get ahead.
I mean, so he is funding, I've seen it with my kids' own school, how threadbare it's got, how much of a battle is that, you're so focused on the core academics, and I know you've made the point that at your school you try and be broader, but, there's not much money left for these kind of very crucial add-ons, in inverted commas.
There's no money left, none at all. So yeah, funding is a real struggle. You have to sacrifice other things in order to bring those kind of services into the school. A lot of those 30 services that I spoke about are voluntary or already funded through the Mayor's office or something else. And so the funding solution for us is a bigger picture, and that's a separate conversation, I think.
Well, sorry, go on, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, there's funds coming through health. Health has a real desire to move upstream. Health, in some cases, is willing to invest, has the desire to come in earlier. Education is trying to put some in, but if we could just join up those things, and even in some cases with corporate and philanthropic support, so you invest £1 in a service in a school such as yours, you put education, health, and philanthropic together, now you've got £3 to invest in this sort of support. So we can just join things up.
Come back to that point. You wanted to come in, Siggy?
Yeah, I do also just want to say that this is, for me, absolutely, schools need funding to help deal with the issues, but it's not preventative. And like you said, we need to get into schools earlier, primary school. But like I keep saying, it's about empowering communities and empowering families, and that's what's really broken. It's the communities and the families.
Well, I did say I'd come back to parenting and the role of parenting, because we can sit here and talk about what's going on in your school, and you've got your charity and you've got crunching your numbers. But do you think people are shy about talking about the parental role and how parents are letting their kids down? Said people were shy about it.
I think it's a difficult situation to navigate. When you're a parent in chaos, the answers aren't there. And so often what I'm dealing with is generational trauma. They don't understand what it means to be a young person living today, first and foremost. But beyond that, they don't understand what parenting tools they need to provide in order to allow their young people to flourish.
I mean, is part of the solution bringing the parents into the school? And, you know, can you get charities to work with the parents alongside the kids?
There are so few organizations that I have come across that take that holistic approach, and I think that's really sad. Yes, that is part of the solution. My biggest fight in turning Shirley Park around from where it was when I took over 6 years ago to where it is now was the parents. It was the families who were tougher to turn than the children. And that's because there aren't services plugged into the families in order to really unpick that. Social services has its own stigma and only goes so far. There are barriers against working with social services, and I think there's something greater to unpick there.
Is that one of the missing pieces that, you know, there are charities that aim at the kids, but what about bringing the parents into that conversation?
I totally agree. And then, I mean, that is one of the key things that we drive within Place to Be and talk about. It's work with parents, work with staff in the schools. The role of parents is huge. And going back to, you use the word connection and belonging, creating a school environment where parents, where our clinicians, you know, they're there at the school gate or they're part of the school system. And especially in the primary school, there's no stigma. You're used to dropping off your child, and parents will open up and ask for help. Any of the parents that we see in the schools we work with, they want to do the best by their children. And when that support is accessible and available, they will access it. And it does make a huge difference. In terms of evidence of what really works, we know that for children where conduct disorder is clear, the research and the evidence shows that if you work with the parent and the child together, that makes a huge difference. And they're the children that are the ones that end up going down in the downward spiral, get excluded, are the biggest cost to the public purse. Supporting parents and helping parents to do their job, you know, that's the real solution. But funds aren't especially there for who's paying for parenting programs today.
Right. Well, I want to come back to who's providing these services. But Matt, just a brief thought from you on the new government promised to put mental health on a par with physical health. Do you see any early signs of that happening?
I don't. I think there's a lot of for the government getting its house in order and trying to work out exactly how it delivers on the promises it's made. I think the mood music coming out, as far as we can tell, is still positive. Is still that is a priority for the government. And I think if you think about their mission-led approach and this idea of opportunity being one of the key missions, then clearly tackling this challenge is a big part of that. And encouragingly, one of the messages certainly that we've been having is this appetite for engaging with the charity sector in order to better understand the issues that are going on in the country and the solutions that you can deliver. And I think that's a key thing here. So we've all talked about the role that charities can play, but actually ensuring that they're part of the conversation and not just coming along at the end being given not enough funding to pick up the pieces is a really important part of all this.
Well, picking up on that point, Sakib, you had that striking figure that you said you had about 30 organisations coming in. How much of this work is being well done by charities and how much needs to be done by the state? Are you happy with most of it being done by charities or not?
I think the answer is community focused. I think the answer is grassroots organizations being empowered to help. Things from a top-down level, from a governmental level, always feel a little bit removed. It's certainly not the council's place to get inside the household. Obviously, it is when there's huge safeguarding concerns, something beyond that. But what we're talking about is so nuanced that it is very much around charities being part of the community and helping the community. And those community projects aren't funded well enough. Those community projects are few and far between. And we definitely need more of them. And if we're going to make a difference inside the household, it's got to be grassroots services from the community, of the people, to make that difference.
I mean, it's quite striking how many people sort of came forward and offered to help you after that terrible tragedy you had to deal with. But I mean, are charities spreading themselves too thinly? Are there too many operating in this sphere?
I think what Matt said really resounded with me, which was resonated with me, sorry, which was that people in the room are trying to fight over the same pot of money, which is something we have in Croydon with services all the time. And so there are some really, really good services but they're all going for the same. They're all looking at the same website where all these pots of money are available and all applying for the same things. And so when you've got that, often they're competing and they're not collaborating. It goes back to your point.
Kevin, what's your answer to this point about, charities versus the state? And, are you all scrabbling for the same pot of money?
There's definitely scrabbling goes on. I think grassroots charities are in a really good position to really engage without stigma and to build capacity from the ground up in the community. I think there's also a role for charities around really showing how to fill the gaps, but we shouldn't be there then as an ongoing service provider doing it. So something like seeing mental health support teams being put in place nationally, I think is a good development. But I think we now need, as a charity, we're striving to show how you can improve and build on that and make that, even better, stronger, more evidence-based.
I mean, just we're going to move to sort of quick fire questions and then bring in questions from the audience in just a second. But just one final thought on parenting. Do parents, like even in your view, know how to access help, whether it's from the state or from charities?
No, they don't. And often they're too embarrassed to access that help. And that's some of the difficulties, that stigma you have to help remove. And you can only remove that when it's people who are local, who they know, rather than something external to them. If you know.
And could schools do a better job helping parents navigate that? Or do you find that the parents that you're seeing at events or whatever are not the parents who necessarily need the help most?
So schools can signpost. It's really difficult for schools to get inside the house in that way and change habits inside the home. They definitely need help with services that provide that kind of offer for families. It's not something that would be easy for schools to navigate.
Okay, I'm going to try and draw some of these threads together. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you all for bringing those thoughts. And do have some questions in the audience. Online, I've got questions coming in on the device here, multiple devices. Unfortunately, that is one of the things. I've just turned off my WhatsApp notifications because I can't bear it constantly pinging. So I'm trying to look after my own mental health as well. If you had one, I want to ask each of the panelists, if you had one policy to turn around these trends in child mental health, what would that policy be? Catherine, starting with you.
Invest properly in primary schools. And I think I'd also strip out the exams and look at the curriculum in primary schools. So we can build in much more around children engaging and enjoying the wider, richer curriculum, and also learning about emotions and how you can learn about your own good mental health.
Get rid of SATs, basically.
Definitely, yeah, decrease the amount of testing and exam pressure.
I mean, even when it comes to later, I've got a child doing GCSEs this next year. Yeah, I mean, the amount that they have to learn is completely different. Like, it's just absolute memory game. Anyway, so that's a whole other discussion. Saqib, same question to you. What one policy would you put forward?
I'm glad I didn't go first because my head was spinning with 100 different things. I would say a policy that empowers community organizations to be plugged into schools and for schools and community organizations to share data and share projections and struggles and difficulties around families or young people would be really empowering. And that's absent from the conversation even at the moment.
Yeah. Matt, your go.
I think one thing I'd do is make sure that Catherine and Saqib and probably 10 other people in this room are on an advisory panel for the government. So I think that would make a lot of sense. I think there's something about signal and leadership. So there's a whole bunch of stuff we can get into, and I completely agree with the other two in terms of some of the details. But what if so I had the chart on Netherlands versus the UK, and that gap that remains even when you change some of the objective stuff that you can measure. What's the gap? Some norms. It's the fact that in the Netherlands, you expect the education system to be about supporting children to be the very best they can be. And academic outcomes is part of that. Attendance at school might be part of that, but that's not the priority. And speaking as a parent of a child with autism who is having lots of challenges with attendance, I know that the conversation with our school is very much focused on the attendance and the exam outcomes rather than the mental health of my daughter. And I think that will vary from school to school, from head teacher to head teacher. But if we had a very clear signal from national government that this is a priority for this country, this is a challenge that cannot be missed, then I think that gives everybody the freedom, parents, teachers and others, to really engage in what actually matters rather than dancing around the idea that this is just about attendance or just about exam results.
Really, really interested that none of you focused on the digital devices, because just from this is my kind of personal bugbear. I sort of think if you get rid of Twitter, X, Facebook, the lot of it, get rid of it all, the world will be a much happier place. But anyway, before we go to questions, I just got a couple of other quick-fire questions for the panel. Message to the Health Secretary, Catherine. If the Health Secretary was in this room, what would you get him to focus on?
Shift upstream, find funds somewhere within the health budget and shift upstream.
Just to expand on that a little bit more.
To invest in more preventative work. So some of the work, join it with the pound from education and give schools some of the resources that they need.
And if he comes back and says, well, there's social care that's a huge hole in the head, there's, hospitals that are crumbling, I've got all of these competing resources, what would you say that argues mental health to the top of his intro?
Children are the future, are the next generation. So if we want to get ahead of this, we can't just, write off a whole generation of children and young people.
Time to put your money where your mouth is on mental health having parity with physical health. So keep your message to, I'm going to ask you actually message to the Chancellor.
Oh, God. I think ultimately my message is that it takes a village to raise a child. And if we really want to see a difference amongst young people, amongst deprived communities, then we need to build those communities, and we need to fund not just the schools, we need to fund the services around schools, we need to fund the community groups, the church groups, the youth groups, all of that in order to really help raise a young person mentally and emotionally in order to allow them to flourish.
So actually it's really a message for Angela Rayner, really, or, it's the Cabinet more generally. Matt, your message to either the Health Secretary or the Chancellor, because you said you wanted easy questions. They've done the difficult job.
I wondered where you were going to go with that. I thought you were going to ask me about what I was going to say to the Pope or something.
You can do that too.
Again, look, I think part of it is this leadership, but I think part of it as well is to channel that sort of inner Gordon Brown and remember the investor save approach to running a country.
And actually, on that note, the early intervention that I've heard successive governments talk about, and you just think if one government had made a good job of early intervention and just, intervening in kids' lives very young, and you were talking about primary school, then actually we might be reaping some of those rewards now financially and in terms of well-being. So let's have some questions now. We're going to have questions in the room, but also I've got some questions coming in online as well. So there is one roving mic. So I'm going to do these two questions together. If we could have the gentleman with the glasses on his head and then the lady in the row behind.
Thank you very much for putting this on. 2 points. The last 25 years, we have seen so much change that nobody has any certainty about their place in the world. And that's rippled right through every generation. Nobody knows what jobs they're going to be able to do, what's going to be there. Secondly, for whatever reasons, I think there are more children who don't have siblings, and that prevents them from building up the resilience with Catchman mentioned earlier. And that, I wonder if there is any correlation between number of children and family.
Okay. And let's have the question behind as well, and we'll distribute that.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sabrina from Future Youth Zone. We're a youth centre in East London. My question is really around what you were saying, Saqib, about community resources and out-of-school resources and charities and what they can provide. But also, I'm interested that you're an academy. I know this is a tenuous topic. My partner works for United Learning, but the role of academies in education and the rules that they bring into schools, especially behaviour policies, detentions, isolation, and how those contribute to youth mental health.
Okay, Sakib, I'm going to get you to answer that one first, and then I'll come back to the gentleman's question afterwards.
Yeah, look, young people flourish in structure. And so I know there is this conversation around, oh my God, are you going to have detentions? Are you going to have inclusion rooms, we call them, not isolation, and all of that other kind of stuff. Ultimately, what you need is trauma-informed staff that aren't going to trigger a young person into more mental health issues. Of course, if a young person does something silly, they need a consequence. If a young person continues to do something silly, they probably need intervention. And so it's about being trauma-informed as practitioners. And you related that back to academies. I mean, I don't want to get into the politics of academies. Ultimately, I am as part of Oasis Academy Shirley Park, I'm part of one of the largest multi-academy trusts in the UK, which is Oasis. But Oasis have an ethos that's very much inclusive. And so Oasis are about trauma-informed practitioners. So every single teacher has CPD around being trauma-informed. Our schools are set up so that, yes, we deal with consequence, but we deal with consequence in a very, very humanitarian kind of fashion. So I guess my answer is that you need structure, you need consequence. Young people need to understand that actions have consequences. And where that is a repeated behavior, it's on my practitioners, my middle leadership, my heads of years, to make sure that intervention is there and we've unpicked that.
Matt, I wanted to come to you about the question before on change, because I think you make a very good point. And, my kids are always saying to me, oh, what a sort of bleak world it is, because I'm always saying it is on the news. And in many ways it is. But I mean, Matt, have you got any sort of stats, both on that and also this point about siblings? I have no idea whether there are more only children now, but certainly people are probably having smaller families. Is there, and Sakib's been talking about community, this sense of sort of isolation and fear of the future, and things are changing at a more rapid pace, although you could look back and look at previous eras where things changed. What's that quote about Lenin? Anyway, you know what I mean. Is it more the case now than it has been in the past?
Yeah, so no stats, unfortunately, but members of my team who are probably already rolling their eyes, knowing that Matt's going to talk about risk again, because I think there is something here, and it's something that I talk about a lot, and I think we will go on to do work on at PBE. In a previous life, I was involved in the Intergenerational Commission back at Resolution Foundation, and it's something that we focused on, which is this transfer of risk from institutions to individuals. So you think about the defined benefit pension, which is now a defined contribution pension. So the risk as you reach retirement is on the individual rather than the corporation. You think about what's going on in the housing market and the fact that 30 years ago it took somebody on a typical wage 3 years to save a typical deposit for a house, and now it's 21 years. So people aren't doing it. That is probably feeding through into people being more vulnerable at transition moments in their life than was the case previously. And that is causing spirals into low well-being. And it's probably also the case that people are behaving differently in order to mitigate those risks. And it would not surprise me if the number of children that people in particular groups are having is one of those, although as I say, I don't have the stats there. And I think that is something that as a society we need to get to grips with, that we have transferred all this risk in the pursuit of individualism and growth and productivity, and we've lost, as Sakib's been saying, that sort of community support, that institutional support, and that sense that somebody's got your back. And what that actually then means from a purely economic perspective, and sort of forget about the moral case for looking after our kids, is that we're no longer as a country taking good risks. We're not as dynamic as we used to be. We're not moving jobs as often as we used to be, because we're scared if we move jobs and go to a new rented accommodation, then the new landlord isn't going to be quite as nice as the one we've got at the moment.
I also think the political upheaval has taken a toll. The successive governments where things have felt like, what's happening to our mortgages, that rubs off on kids, doesn't it, with parents worrying about that. And I sometimes think that actually the onus is on us as parents to be more upbeat about the world, because there are good things happening. in the moment, even if the future looks rather bleak. I'm going to take a question online. This is actually for you, Matt, as well, which says, Matt mentioned in his presentation that low income isn't a driver of poor mental health in isolation. What are the other factors that amplify its impact?
I want to make sure I interpret that question correctly.
Promise some difficult questions.
Yeah. So certainly there's a correlation between low income and the level of mental health of children in that household. Whenever you run any of these sorts of, again, statistical modeling, you are controlling for everything else that's going on. And some of the factors which are likely to be driving that correlation in a low-income household are being picked up by other variables. So it's not that there isn't a correlation, it's that there's just other stuff sitting within those households which is driving this. And it might be around some of those family situations. It might be around the actual schools that kids in more deprived areas are attending, and some of the school culture variables dominating. But I think that point about the perception, which I did talk about, and the idea that kids are aware of their relative position and a sense of, well, my family's a poor family, or my dad's not got the same job that his dad's got. That is definitely playing out. And again, that will be correlated with income in the first place. But it's the way in which it's playing through in terms of the kids' perception and sense of self-worth that's really coming through in a strong way, rather than the actual material deprivation.
We've probably got time for one more question. I see so many hands, but I mean, perhaps you can address some of the questions during drinks afterwards in just a few moments. Let's have a question over here, please. Thank you, with the check shirt. Just all the way. Sorry, I'm making you get your steps in. Sorry. Great.
Hi, thank you. Harbi Jama from the London Community Foundation. Thank you, first of all, for championing small grassroots organisations, because we know the impact they have in London in particular, but across the country. Maybe this is for Matt. I know you said you don't want hard questions, but is there a benefit of maybe the world of philanthropy to do a hyper-localised kind of funding and research, maybe for a particular borough or a few boroughs, where maybe you can then research and actually see the real impact of communities and education and health working together to make an impact? And the second point was about charities being spread thinly. I really disagree on that point. I hate that question, sorry. I really do. I think there's a lot of funding available in dormant charities and funders who actually don't give it out. So again, do we go for the US model where organizations are forced to give out a percentage of their income?
Very good question. Matt.
Yeah, actually, that's a tough question, but it's one that I really welcome, because it gives me a chance in part to plug the Law Family Commission on Civil Society, which hopefully people have already read and absorbed, which talks exactly about some of these things. And I think that point about getting that money out of the foundations a bit more rapidly, a bit more readily is definitely part of that. But also, I think that point about the role of philanthropy and that hyper-local approach is a really important one. And we were talking before about the role of charities and why the charities versus state approach. And one of the, let's say, two key strengths of charities relative to the state doing something. One is that nuance, that hyper-locality, that ability to deal with very particular population groups. Actually, there's three things. Another is the trust that they have. That if the state is coming along and doing something, it may not be trusted, but the charity and the community organisations will be. And the third is it's going back to risk. It's ability to take risks, to innovate, to experiment, but especially where that funding is philanthropic. Because I think when we were talking a lot before about the sort of funding within the charity sector for this sort of stuff, there's an implied sense there that we're talking about contracts and commissioned stuff that's coming from the state. But obviously, philanthropy is a really big part here as well. And where you've got philanthropic funding and grant-making trusts and foundation funding, which is saying, let's have a go. Let's give this a try. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We try again, and we keep trying until we get the solution, as opposed to taxpayer-funded money, which if you get it wrong, then you're being hauled across the coals. So I think absolutely that has to be part of the solution as well.
Well, I know there are lots more questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take more, but there will be a chance to ask the panelists while you all have a drink. I'd like to say thank you, everyone in the audience, for coming and for listening. Thank you to everyone who tuned in online. Thank you very much to our panelists. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. And Pro Bono Economics would love to hear from you, so do get in touch with any thoughts. If you've got things to offer, you can also sign up to the PBE newsletter and follow them on socials to hear about future events like this. They're a small charity. We've been talking about small charities. They rely on generous supporters to fund their work, so if you do feel able to make a donation, they would be very grateful. You can do so via the QR code in your programme. Thank you very much to the sponsors of the event, the Rigby Foundation, Oxford Economics and Exchange Data International. Their generosity has played a huge part in today's event being such a success. And thank you to the PBE team for briefing me so well. Becky did an amazing job. I can't see her, but she did an amazing job. Thank you, Becky, at the top. And I'd just like to hand over to Matt Whitaker now to close the event and thank you all himself.
And thank you to Cathy, obviously, for being so generous with her time. And Cathy has to catch a train, so if you want to sneak off while I do the final 30 seconds, I won't be offended. But it is just 30 seconds, which is to echo the thanks that Cathy's given out to everybody there, including, of course, the PBE team. And to reiterate what we said at the start, which is what I hope we get out of today is not just the conversation we've had here on the stage and the questions we've had, but that the network that exists already within this room grows ever stronger, and that we prompt interesting new thoughts amongst each other and we build new connections. So with that in mind, please do go back up the stairs, turn left and off to your left again. Join us for a drink if you can. Not least because when we first set this whole event up, we were pitching it actually as our 15th birthday party. So we wanted to make tonight very much about the topic and about the conversation, and that's right. But it is also our birthday, and we want to raise a glass to that. And we also want to raise a glass to the fact that this is probably the last public event at which we will have Gus O'Donnell as our chair. He's been with us for almost since the start in one form or another, and over the last 8 or 9 years as chair, and has done a fantastic job. So our co-founder, Andy Haldane's going to say a few nice words about both of those things next door in a minute, so I'll let him do that. But it's only right that those of you that can do come along and raise a glass to Gus, because he is a brilliant champion for PBE, a brilliant person, and every bit as lovely as the rumours suggest. So please come and join us on that, and thank you again for coming.
Sorry, quickest group photo ever.